I'm Nick Hernandez. Thank you so much for listening to the Positivity Matters podcast. On this program, we talk about well-being, particularly at the intersection that it can have with community. And I am very excited today to have as my guest Dr. Isaac Prilleltensky. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Nick. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for being here. Dr. Prilleltensky was born in Argentina and has lived and worked in Israel, Canada, Australia, and the United States. He is the director of the Community Leadership Doctoral Program at the University of Miami. His humor columns have been published in the Miami Herald and Miami Today. His latest book is How People Matter: Why It Affects Health, Happiness, Love, Work, and Society. So this is particularly an honor to have you as a guest on the show. My initial interest in positive psychology came about from the StrengthsFinder, and it was such an uplifting experience to discover that I did the Googling, and that was the moment back in 2006 when I realized there was such a thing as positive psychology. I'd never heard of that before. I didn't know that psychology was studying well-being, and it was just incredibly exciting. And I believe I saw somewhere that an aspiration of the field was to make a difference for individuals, organizations, and communities. And that sort of spotlight on community just sort of ignited something in me. And I have not let go of that interest since that time. And it seems like your work is one of the few center points at that intersection of community and well-being. So thank you so much again.
My pleasure. I'm happy to share whatever you think will be helpful.
Okay. So I think let's maybe talk a little bit about what is well-being, I guess, from maybe the philosophical or the research perspective, and what does the framework that you've come to develop over the years look like?
Well, first of all, well-being is a positive state of affairs as defined by individuals themselves. And the framework we have developed is multidimensional. In other words, it means that no single aspect of our lives can capture the totality of well-being. So we develop a model which is quite consistent with other models, especially the Gallup model of well-being, in which we believe there are 6 key components, and they are summarized in the acronym ICOPE, which stands for interpersonal, community, occupational, physical, psychological, and economic well-being. So these are the 6 domains. So it's ICOPE with a double P for physical and psychological well-being. And there is a lot of research demonstrating the reciprocal relationships among these domains. So for example, if you have good interpersonal well-being, if you are surrounded by people who care about you, and you have social support and good quality relationships, your psychological well-being goes up, and also your physical well-being goes up. When your community well-being is up, you also feel better overall. Your emotional well-being goes up. So in short, these 6 domains are interrelated. You can also imagine that if your economic well-being is very depressed, people who live in poverty, all their energy goes towards that which they don't have. So they worry a lot about paying the bills, and they worry a great deal about providing for their kids and their families. And subsequently, they don't have a lot of mental energy free energy, for example, to dedicate to physical well-being. They're too consumed, right? They're too worried
Yeah.
about that which they don't have. One final example, you can think about occupational well-being. If your boss doesn't treat you with respect, if there isn't fairness in the workplace, then that also tends to affect your psychological well-being. So this is our model. It's multidimensional. They're all interrelated. One final thing that I should mention, which relates to an important distinction in well-being, is what researchers call evaluative versus experiential well-being. And they are not the same. So experiential well-being is when you ask a person, have you smiled a lot yesterday? Or did you experience joy? Or were you sad yesterday? Or now? How are you feeling this moment? That's experiential. That's how I'm feeling now. This is different from evaluative well-being, which is asking individuals, how could you evaluate your life, your interpersonal relations, your physical well-being? So that requires people to think about, how am I perceiving my life overall, as opposed to how am I feeling right now? One is more emotional, the experiential. The other one is more reflective, more cognitive. So it's important to understand that some researchers focus on the experiential, others on the evaluative. And Gallup, for instance, they tend to focus on the evaluative. And you are probably familiar, every year there is an international index of happiness around different countries, and they tend to ask about evaluative well-being. How satisfied are you in life, etc. So I just wanted to make this distinction because, I'm from Latin America. I grew up in Argentina, and some Latin American countries, they get very high scores on experiential well-being, but low scores on evaluative well-being.
Oh,
So they tend
interesting.
to be happy because they are very sociable, family oriented, a great deal of social support. So that makes them feel, oh, I smile a lot, I enjoy my time with friends. But when you ask them to think about their economic well-being, life is not going so well. So you can see that some countries are high on one aspect, not so much on others.
That makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I saw in the introduction was that you've written on humor, and that jumps out to me because I see that as sort of an essential part of play, which I see is sort of a vital part of human flourishing overall. I tried to look through the philosophical and scholarly literature, and I came up with a framework as an acronym: Happy Life. And it's
Mm-hmm.
health, aesthetic experience, play, pleasure, yes saying. I think that's a phrase from Nietzsche, which is his, just a nod to purpose and meaning. Life, like the whole web of life, information, knowledge, friendship, and engagement. And so that humor, I think, is like a huge part of play, and it's like a big builder of friendship also. So that was fascinating to see that you had that specifically referenced in your work. And I was kind of curious about that sort of humor and your own well-being, and sort of what was the history of that for you? Was that just something that's always been a part of your life, or was that something that had some intentional cultivation? And
Yeah, that's a
yeah.
good question. We were talking earlier about strengths before we came on air. We came on the air, and um, I think when I did one of those strengths finders surveys, humor came out as one for me, and it didn't surprise me. So a few years back, I want to say maybe 10 years ago, I started writing humor columns, first for the Miami Herald and then for Miami Today, two newspapers here in South Florida, and I really enjoyed it. Um, and I have had a few opportunities before, to write funny speeches for friends' weddings, my son's bar mitzvah, like different occasions, anniversaries for friends and stuff like that. And I really enjoyed it. And humor is a very cathartic and flow experience
Mm.
at the same time. So many of your readers, if they are familiar with positive psychology, they will be familiar with the concept of flow, which means um, you derive pleasure from concentrating intensely on an activity. Some people derive this from playing a musical instrument or um, learning a language or playing the violin or being a great athlete. You can derive flow from many different ways, right? Or dancing. So for me, humor writing was an opportunity to be in flow. And first, I started writing for myself, and if I laughed and if my wife laughed, then we had a good time. And then, as I said, I started publishing humor columns, and eventually, my wife and I wrote a trilogy, The Laughing Guides. So we have The Laughing Guide to Well-being, The Laughing Guide to a Better Life, and The Laughing Guide to Change. So we wrote these three books in which we combine a humor with science. And these were kind of my two strengths, you might say, that I enjoy writing humor and that I'm a psychologist interested in the science of well-being. So we combined the two in these three books, which it was a lot of fun to do in an alternative way to educate the public about the science of well-being, because a lot of the writings about well-being tend to be very I want to say sermon like, like if you don't do this or that, some catastrophic event will happen. So we try to make it lighter and more accessible.
That's awesome. I've been thinking about the sort of a um, play-based education, or like education that uses the power of play and friendship, as sort of a for some reason those ideas just took hold of me recently, and it's like I just can imagine like how much more well-being could be created in the education process itself if it drew more on like the power of play and friendship. So
Well, there is a
um
history in education, for place-based education.
mm,
The Montessori school of thought eh, is highly regarded all over the world. So yeah, I agree with you. There is a lot to be said because it builds on your strengths, something that comes easy. Play comes easy to kids, right? Kids learn through play, and we adults, unfortunately, we don't do enough of it. Um, but it's a great way to learn.
yeah, that's one of the things that I've been trying to sort of work my brain around, is in our difference making, to make sure that we have like the playful dimension of it. Though it's like I think the, sort of like the compassion based difference making is crucial, because to actually take care of adversity and suffering that needs to be taken care of first, kind of. But it's like, there's that play as well. One of the things I found to try to sort of in in spark some more play in my community is to organize a night of a swing dance called West Coast Swing. And then the other kind of difference making that really seems vital is the generative, like kind of the mentoring the teaching. So yeah, like I think that that is just so essential for building community. And I love that you've got humor in your sort of the way that you've approached it. So I don't know if I've heard of that even before. So it's like not only it's the rarity of community and well-being, but then you also have the humor and the play involved in that. Like that's really just incredible.
Well, we really believe that the more engaging ways you find to educate people about well-being, the better. So in addition to these books that I mentioned, there is a free website. It's called funforwellness.com, funforwellness.com, in which we created a playful platform to educate people about the I cope domains of well-being and also about specific strategies to promote well-being in each of the I cope domains. So our method of change is called Bet I Can, and it stands for different drivers of change. So what's a driver of change? Something that you can leverage to promote well-being. For example, B stands for behaviors. Okay, so what can you do concretely? What habit can you create to promote your well-being? E stands for emotions, T for thoughts, I for interactions, C for context, A for awareness, and N for next steps. And within each of these drivers of change, we teach people what concretely can you do to promote well-being, for example, in the interpersonal domain, or in the psychological domain. How can you cultivate positive emotions? How can you learn to savor the moment? How can you manage negative emotions, which are really important for psychological well-being? So we use the better I can strategies in this platform that we call Fun for Wellness. So we tried to use different means of reaching the population, not just books, but also a free website.
Well, that's some difference making right there. I appreciate hearing about that, and I will make sure to have that in wherever we put the podcast. So
Thank you.
that is great. So being in the field of academia and focused on well-being, I'm curious about the sort of the scope of the field for scholarship at that intersection. Is it is there anyone else besides you? It seems like whenever I try to look it up, I see you. Is there is it growing? What's the potential for this? It seems like that it's sort of the possibility of I've seen like chief well-being officers popping up in corporate settings, and it seems like it's the kind of thing that a city could have like as a like the right next to the mayor you've got your community well-being manager or officer or whatever coordinator.
Right.
What yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Nick. So, here at the University of Miami, we have a community well-being PhD program, which trains academics, researchers, policymakers. But we also started an education doctorate, an EDD, in community leadership to do exactly what you are describing, Nick, to prepare professionals in community organizations, in government, in not-for-profits, foundations, universities, and also in the corporate world to promote not just happiness, but well-being. And the two are related, but they are not the same. So well-being consists of these dimensions that I described, the I cope domains, but you have to ask yourself, where does it come from? And the research that we have done shows that there are two important predictors of well-being. One of them is mattering, the sense that you matter in the world. And another one is fairness. So we say that wellness is related to fairness and worthiness, which is just a synonym for mattering, right? That people feel that they are worthy human beings. So it's important to understand what are the antecedents of well-being. And what we find is that in cities, in countries, because we conducted some international studies, in countries, in cities, in organizations, in communities, what really matters is whether you feel like you matter. And how do we define mattering? We define mattering as feeling valued and adding value. So feeling valued is all about feeling respected, seen, heard, appreciated, acknowledged as a human being in your organization, in the workplace, in the community, even in your dealings with government. When you approach a government office, do they treat you with respect? Do they treat you fairly? Do they make you feel like you matter as a citizen? Or do they just ignore you? Do they diminish your sense of self-worth? So that's the feeling valued part. That is fundamental to the human experience. The other part is adding value. All of us want to be able to make a contribution to workplace, to the community, to our family, to the world. Maybe you want to improve the environment, or you want to reduce poverty or homelessness. You want to make a difference, right? All of us want to make a difference. And it turns out that feeling valued and adding value, the more you feel like you matter, the higher your sense of well-being. And if you ask yourself, where does mattering come from? It turns out that it comes from a lot of experiences of fair treatment. Are you treated fairly at home, at work, in the community? Do you experience discrimination or marginalization? For people who are lucky enough to experience fairness in their life, in their community, they feel like they matter because people treat them with respect. People want to hear what they have to say. And the more you feel like you matter, the higher your well-being. So this is the essence of how we approach community well-being, right? We want to create experiences of fairness, fair, just policies, fair, just organizations, governments, families, workplaces, because they make you feel like you matter. And the more you feel like you matter, the happier you are.
Yeah, that's a great chain of correlations. That is really fascinating. So with so many variables, it sounds like that you could spend several hundred lifetimes studying all the correlations and all the possibilities with all these vectors. So
Yes, but luckily there are ways to measure these things. So we use some existing international databases. And what this program in community leadership is trying to achieve is to translate the knowledge into practice. So if you are a city manager, for example, just to pick up on your example, Nick, if you're a city manager and you talk to the mayor or your board of directors or council members, and they say, what are we going to do to improve, Lincoln, Nebraska, or what are you going to do to improve Miami or a neighborhood? It's really important to think about these three aspects and how they are related: wellness, fairness, and worthiness. Because a great motivator in life is to feel that you are significant, that you count, that you are important in the eyes of your city, in the eyes of your teachers, in the eyes of your employer, in the eyes of your peers. It's almost a psychological necessity, just like we need air and nutrition and shelter, for our physical well-being. We need a sense of mattering for our psychological well-being. And we want to train leaders, community leaders, who can translate all of these concepts into specific programs and policies.
That is really fascinating. I was thinking about the happy life framework that I came up with, and it seems like that's the sort of the heart of friendship, is that the mattering that takes place in friendship. And I see that
Yes.
potential to expand out across the community. Is, I guess you could say that mattering is the process and friendship is the outcome, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that friendship is possibly a key dynamic to make you feel like you matter, right? When you are out with your buddies or you engage with your friends and peers at work, and you what's friendship? Friendship is you feel loved and you love somebody else, right? You
Yeah.
feel loved and you offer love. And in the best of times, this works like a virtuous cycle. The more you feel loved, the more full you are and capable of offering love to somebody else. So that's what we want to do. We want to spread love.
Yeah, it's like that the sort of like the upside when there's like the positives, and then being there to support somebody if they hit a speed bump, I guess you could say, and like
Yes.
seeing the best in each other and sort of drawing that out. Like that's kind of
Yes,
those
exactly.
dynamics. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what do you see in the on the horizon for um like the research itself? Like what kinds of questions are you asking yourself these days?
Yeah. So what I just described, the relationship between wellness, fairness, and worthiness or mattering, we call this the common good framework. In our view, these three pillars of the community, we call them psychosocial goods or psychosocial resources. And we believe that the more we bolster wellness and fairness, the happier, healthier people will be, both in the evaluative and in the experiential sense, right? We want people to be happy, to have a lot of positive emotions, to laugh, to experience humor, to be engaged in flow. But we also want them to evaluate their life in a positive way, right? Because conceivably you could say, well, I'm on drugs all day, so I'm high. So if you ask me, how are you doing? Oh, I feel high. But how is your evaluative well-being? Possibly not so great, right? Because I'm
Mm.
addicted. So you couldn't just do one without the other. You need both experiential and you need evaluative well-being. So my research now is focusing on what we call the common good framework. And we have plans now to evaluate these relationships that I was describing before between wellness, fairness, and worthiness at the international level, but also at the local level. We want to see whether these factors, wellness, fairness, and worthiness, can explain the common good of a community. So if you ask a neighbor, what's your experience of fairness here? Well, some people may say, I experience fairness with my neighbors, but not so much with the police. Or I experience fairness if you are a child or an adolescent, maybe they'll say, I experience fairness with my teacher, but not so much with my family. Who knows, right? There are so many permutations. So we want to understand from both at a community level and at the international level, national and international level. We want to be able to discern whether this model really reflects people's experiences. And if not, what are we missing? So I'm really interested in what we might call the common good. The common good, my interest derives also from some of the shortcomings that I see in some societies today, which I quite simply define as having either a me culture or a we culture. And in a me culture, people are driven by the following. People say, I have the right to feel valued so that I can be happy and healthy. So it's all about rights. It's all about feeling valued. It's all about being happy. That's a me culture. But what about a we culture? In a we culture, we say, I have the right and responsibility to feel valued and add value to myself and others so that we can all experience not just wellness, but also fairness. So here you see the difference between a me culture and a we culture. And we believe that if we balance the attention we pay nowadays to rights with responsibility, and if we balance the attention to feeling valued with adding value, and if we balance the attention to happiness with fairness, we think we are on our way to create happier and healthier communities.
This is a beautiful model. I'm having an aesthetic experience right now. Thank you.
I'm glad. Yes, so that's what you asked me about my research. What's next? So I'm working on with data sets at the international level, but also at the local level. So we find that exciting. I think it's a challenge for society how to go back to the common good as opposed to the tribal good. The tribal good is just what's good for me and my tribe. That's not good enough. That's a recipe for disaster, which we are experiencing at multiple communal, national, and international levels. So I'm trying to find how can we go back to the common good as opposed to the tribal good.
Dr. Prilleltensky, thank you so much for being a guest on the Positivity Matters podcast. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to offer listeners?
No, just thank you for the opportunity. If people are interested in, I have many publications freely available. on professorisaac.com. People can go to my website, and there are lots of blogs and talks, lectures, and freely available papers that people can access if they want to explore more some of these ideas. professorisaac.com.
That has been the Positivity Matters podcast this week. www.positivitymatters.com. Thank you so much for listening.